Hey class, it's time for some background information that will help us in our study of animal farm. As you can tell from the subtitle of this PowerPoint, this is Russian history. Because Taylor, Animal Farm is set in England, not Russia. Yeah, I know, life can be confusing. But the events of Animal Farm are representative of events that happened in Russia from 1917 until a little bit after World War II. So bear with me, this will all make sense eventually. What was Russia like before all of this? Russia had been a czarist autocracy since Peter the Great in the 1700s. It had become a world power after the defeat of Napoleon's army in the 1800s, and it was during these 1800s that there began to grow in Russia a desire for social and political change. Some people didn't like the political system, being ruled by one guy with nearly unlimited power. Some didn't like the economic system. Hey, this is keeping down the little guy and all of that. So there were occasional revolts, and there was the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. That is a socialist political party, and this thing is split between two factions. So those factions are the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks were led by a guy named Lenin, and the Mensheviks were led by nobody really cares because they eventually lost. So Lenin's an interesting guy. He stayed in trouble because of his anti-czarist opinions, and he was imprisoned for a while and even exiled to Siberia, which sounds awesome. Eventually, he ends up settling in Central Europe, waiting for his chance. And that chance will come, so let's not forget about him. But before we get there, we need to talk a little bit more about the Russian emperor at this time, and that is Zar Nicholas II. So what do we know about him? He was often kind. He gave students jobs, students that might not otherwise have had money. And so gave them some jobs, usually spying on people, but still, a job's a job. The people who did not like the system would consider him cruel. In fact, his detractors gave him the nickname Bloody when his guard opened fire on a peaceful march back in 1905. Most importantly for our discussion, Nicholas was really bad at running the country. Really, really bad at it. The Russian Empire is enormous, and Nicholas simply wasn't up to the job. Part of this wasn't really his fault. His father, Zar Alexander III, thought it best that Nicholas not learn anything about how to run the empire until he turned 30, which is a strange kind of thing. I guess maybe so he doesn't get designs on killing his dad, or I don't know the reason. But unfortunately for Nicholas and the rest of Russia, his father died when Nicholas was still 26. So he takes over the country and hadn't learned a thing about how to run the empire yet. So not a great system. Russian involvement in World War I led to further complications, causing more unrest. People in the country were struggling, and even the soldiers fighting in World War I were poorly provisioned. In some cases, it had been reported that the supply of firearms was so low that a pair of men would be given a single gun. The man without the gun would wait until his partner was killed, and then he'd grab the gun and keep going. What he'd up to that point, I'm not really sure. So the war was a major problem for Nicholas II. Russia suffered more than any nation in any war up to that point in history. And the war disrupted the economy so heavily that even more moderate groups joined with the radicals that had called for the end of the czarist rule. So, in February of 1917, a revolt happens more or less spontaneously. People riot because of the lack of food in the Russian capital of Petrograd, which is now called St. Petersburg. And despite attempted intervention by the police, the protest continued, and after a couple of days, an army garrison was called to quell the protest. But then most of the army ends up siding with the protesters, and the government completely begins to collapse. A few days after this, Tsar Nicholas II officially abdicates, giving up power, in favor of his brother, but his brother declines. So, this whole thing that just popped up kind of out of nowhere in February happens. And they call this revolution in February the February Revolution because Russians are really, really creative. So a provisional government is organized to rule the country while a new system can be sorted out. And this sets the stage for the Bolshevik takeover, which will happen in a few months. So Lenin, remember Lenin? Lenin returns to Russia in April of 1917 and starts working toward a second revolution, one that will remove this provisional government and replace it with a permanent and, more importantly, a Bolshevik one. Remember, the Bolsheviks are socialists. In October of that year, there's a second revolution, and it's called, yep, you guessed it, the October Revolution. So, Lenin, with the help of Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky, and more on them in a moment, and the Red Guards, launch a full-blown coup against the provisional government and replace it with one actually headed, eventually, by Lenin himself. And this government is based on the tenets of communism. So, equal distribution of wealth, the promotion of atheism, and gender equality. This government quickly arranges a ceasefire with Germany and eventually a peace agreement ending Russian involvement in World War I. As Lenin consolidates power, he starts to make changes, continuing to move the country in a distinctly communist direction. He introduces the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which shows signs of improving the situation for many in Russia due to increased agricultural production. Despite this, many of Russia's former elite and even some of its working and farming class citizens were becoming dissatisfied with Lenin's new government and were trying to raise foreign support for their cause. Lenin saw anyone opposed to communism as an internal enemy, and he used leaders from the Red Army, including Leon Trotsky, to launch a campaign of terror, killing, torturing, or otherwise oppressing his opponents. Thousands of people, many of whom were only suspected of being anti-communist, were slaughtered in unthinkably cruel ways under Lenin. This conflict turns into the Russian Civil War, which ends in 1922, followed by the formation of the Soviet Union. So from this point, I may use the term Soviet Union and Russia synonymously, but they're not technically the same thing. So, things seem to be heading in the direction that Lenin would like, but he up and dies in 1924, and his body's embalmed, preserving it for future generations, like you do. It's still creepily on display in Red Square in the middle of Moscow if you want to go see it. So, not kidding, that's it. So, with Lenin dead, we have some issues here. Power vacuums tend to find themselves filled quickly, and that's the case after Lenin's death. His two right-hand men, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, don't see eye to eye, and a power struggle ensues. Trotsky is a brilliant speaker and thinker. He published books, pamphlets, and the like, attempting to express and spread the ideas of communism. Trotsky was organizationally gifted as well. He was the one who actually organized the October Revolution. And he's a military leader. He's often seen in public in his striking military attire. Stalin, on the other hand, was a born politician. While Trotsky organized, spoke, wrote, attempted to persuade, Stalin used his political position within the party there in the Soviet Union to organize personal and political alliances. Trotsky may have been the intellectual, but Stalin was very clever in his own conniving sort of way. And maybe more importantly, Stalin was absolutely ruthless. This combination of traits would come to serve him well in his endeavors to cement power for himself. One of Trotsky's and Stalin's major philosophical differences was Stalin's focus on communism within the Soviet Union itself, whereas Trotsky wanted to spread the ideas around the world, upending any sort of non-communist political system and giving power back to the people. Through his political alliances and sharp focus on the Soviet Union himself, Stalin ultimately becomes the sole leader of the country. He banishes Trotsky from the Soviet Union altogether. With his major competitor for power out of the way, not so fun fact here, banishment apparently wasn't enough for Stalin, and so he decided that instead of just leaving him exiled, he was going to get rid of him. So he sends multiple groups of assassins to try to take out Trotsky, who's living in Mexico at this point. And one of them finally succeeded with an ice axe. So, with him out of the way, Stalin is going to rule effectively unopposed for the next quarter of a century. So, under his reign, and reign is typically a term that's saved for monarchs, but Stalin is close enough to being king right now, so why not? He focuses on molding the Soviet Union into the nation that he wants it to be. He replaces Lenin's new economic policy with a 5-year plan, or actually several 5-year plans, which were aggressive campaigns to increase the country's productivity while bringing the economy completely under government control. When his plans dissatisfied people, Stalin used force and propaganda to keep them from rebelling. Critical opinions, whether in art, newspaper, cinema, or otherwise, were censored because everything was supposed to cast the Communist Party in a positive light. He believed in controlling the education of the young, stating, "We must rescue children from the harmful influence of the family." And he's going to do this by teaching them the glory of the state. Because censorship and re-education were not always effective, he began a series of purges in which he executed people suspected of holding ideas contrary to his own about how the country should function. Some of those people were killed, some were tortured, some were executed, some were sent to gulags, which are forced labor camps. And he used the NKVD, which most of you will probably not be familiar with, but you have probably heard of the KGB. The KGB is kind of the thing that came after, smaller in scale, but did some similar things. So if you know anything about the KGB, that's what the NKVD did. So since he had internal affairs under his own tight control, he shifted his attention to international affairs. He took Hitler's ascension to power in Germany very seriously and recognized it as a threat. So in 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact, essentially saying, you don't attack me, I won't attack you, and we'll get along just great. And the countries continued trade even though Germany was now or would soon be at war with much of the rest of Europe. For some reason, Stalin, who didn't trust anybody, appears to have trusted Hitler to keep his word. And if that's not the case, maybe Stalin just hoped this agreement would give him time to build up militarily and be able to deal with the German invasion when it did come. I don't know. Well, 1941, Hitler broke the non-aggression pact and attacked Russia. Shocking what? Absolutely nobody, right? And so this western part of the Soviet Union has a terrible toll taken on it by this war. And they have huge losses. But despite those losses, the Soviets were eventually able to drive the Nazis out. During this war, Stalin reopened the churches. But really, not because he believed in any of it, but just because he had designs on using the church and its clergy to help him maintain control over the citizens. After World War II, several other Allied leaders began dealing with Stalin, even though they weren't necessarily on friendly terms. Many of these leaders had no clue how bad the situation was for the average Soviet citizen under Stalin's regime. Stalin remained in control of the Soviet Union until his death in 1953. So look for these things as we read through Animal Farm. You're going to notice a lot of parallels with a lot of characters and a lot of events, and you need to be able to pick those things out as we go.